When Jason Rice claimed to have served 20 years off-world and then returned to his original age, a phenomenon he called the 20 and Back program, many dismissed him outright. Yet by 2025, clinicians began treating clusters of similar testimony as worth studying, with attention growing as whistleblower activity and official reviews entered public debate. That same year, the Pentagon's Anomaly Office acknowledged a surge of reported UAP incidents, a backdrop that made Rice's claims harder to ignore. He had already passed a polygraph years ago, and today the question is how reliable those results really are. The polygraph question in 2025. For decades, the polygraph has occupied an uneasy space between trust and doubt. Judged in some circles as a reliable window into truth and dismissed in others as pseudoscience, its impact has always been disproportionate to its certainty. By 2025, that debate takes on a new dimension. Polygraph discussions are no longer centered only on pulse, breath, and sweating palms, the classic signals once recorded by needles scratching across a chart. Now the conversation turns to what this technology can and cannot tell us about people like Jason Rice. When Rice originally faced an examiner years earlier, the procedure followed established routines. Sensors recorded physical indicators while precise questions were posed. At the time, the examiner's conclusion was cautious but clear. Rice's physiological readings reflected the response of someone who believed what he was saying. That did not prove that his testimony, claims of military service beyond Earth, was factually accurate. It only demonstrated that he was not registering as deceptive within the limits of the instrument. His conviction came through physiologically, which raised as many questions as it answered. What changes by 2025 is the framework for interpreting such results. New methods integrate multiple biometric signals and use artificial intelligence to map patterns across them. Instead of evaluating each input separately, like heart rate on its own or skin conductance in isolation, the updated systems search for inconsistencies across layers. A person might keep breathing steady, but if their pulse spikes or voice tremors reveal cognitive stress, the algorithms can register the mismatch. Researchers describe this as multimodal analysis, or looking for clusters of conflict rather than isolated deviations. This broader approach does not prove whether an event truly happened, but it raises confidence in identifying whether someone is sincerely recalling what feels like memory. Rice's earlier results, when revisited through these models, showed none of the expected cross-signal contradictions. The channels moved in synchrony, with the kind of balance usually linked to memory-based recall. In other words, his testimony remains consistent with the physiological signature of recounting genuine experience, at least by present-day measures. The absence of conflict across signals doesn't establish that spacecraft or extraterrestrial encounters were real, but it reinforces that he was not fabricating his account knowingly. Skeptics have historically argued that strong-willed individuals or trained operatives could outmaneuver the polygraph by learning to regulate certain responses. They worry that practice or psychological conditioning might trick the test. In 2025, researchers emphasize that while no system is immune to manipulation, cross-signal analysis makes intentional masking far more difficult. Rather than claiming such tactics are impossible, studies suggest it is increasingly rare for people to produce convincing consistency across so many independent biometric layers. This nuance matters. The polygraph cannot certify that Rice traveled to Mars, yet it does make the case that his body aligned with the story he told. That distinction changes the center of the debate. For years, critics dismissed Rice on the assumption of deliberate invention, that he was performing a script with apparent calm. Today, the technology points elsewhere. If deception markers remain absent, then deliberate lying is no longer the most plausible explanation. Instead, we confront a deeper puzzle. If Rice truly exhibited the physiology of belief, where did that belief originate? Is it memory from actual experiences, or could it stem from another process that embeds conviction just as firmly? The implications resonate beyond Rice as an individual. Across intelligence and security communities, interest in advanced polygraph methods has grown. Agencies use them not to prove contested stories, but to gauge sincerity in sensitive disclosures. Consistency across biometric signals is now seen as a sign of genuine conviction, which can be valuable even when fact-checking the substance is impossible. In that environment, Rice's enduring alignment with truth-like indicators stands out. His case becomes a precedent for how modern tools interpret extraordinary testimony, not verifying events themselves, but clarifying whether they are performed inventions or sincerely lived in the subject's mind. Observers who once saw calmness in his old footage as evidence of rehearsal have had to reconsider. Retroactive reanalysis shows that such steadiness is consistent with memory recall, similar to soldiers recounting combat or astronauts reviewing missions. Psychologists explain that genuine recall often requires less narrative effort than fabricating detail, producing smoother biological rhythms. That smoothness is unusual among fabrications, which typically display micro-irregularities as imagination builds scenes not stored in memory. Rice's lack of such irregularity remains striking. None of this resolves the central mystery. Believing a memory does not confirm its external truth. Experiences can be shaped by trauma, suggestion, or other psychological forces that feel as real as history. Still, the current science supports one conclusion with higher certainty than before. Rice was not consciously fabricating at the time of his testimony. His physiology matched belief, not invention. That narrows but does not close the question, shifting attention from proving events to investigating how such conviction forms. This shift unsettles both advocates and opponents. Supporters cite it as validation that he is not lying, while critics are forced to look for alternative explanations beyond deliberate falsehood. In simple terms, the debate moves from "was he deceitful?" to what best accounts for his unwavering conviction. That revised frame reopens the case in a more complicated way than outright dismissal ever did. And it leaves us with a curiosity gap. If the polygraph more plausibly shows belief than fabrication, then the real inquiry becomes, what could create such specific and persistent belief? To answer that, we must look deeper into the testimonies themselves, especially the part of Rice's story that has always struck audiences as the most implausible of all. The 20 and back puzzle. The most difficult part of Jason Rice's story has always been the idea of the 20 and back program. Serving for 2 decades in an off-world role, and then returning to Earth in the same physical age stretches credibility further than many are willing to follow. For years it was dismissed as pure fantasy, the kind of tale someone might create out of personal belief mixed with science fiction influence. Yet while dismissal came easily, testimonies like Rice's did not remain isolated. By 2025, enough independent accounts had circulated that clinicians and independent investigators began looking at them together. The goal was not to prove that such a program exists, but to examine whether the similarities in these recollections reflected a recognizable pattern that demanded further study. Traditional psychology cautions against putting too much weight on memory. Decades of research have shown that recall can be reshaped by trauma, suggestion, or even the passage of time itself. By this reasoning, 20 and back could represent nothing more than elaborated false memories, individuals unknowingly filling gaps in their own histories with vivid stories that feel true. This has long been the conventional explanation for why people like Rice speak with conviction. They believe it, but belief alone is not proof. What shifted after 2024 was the scale of the data being reviewed. A single extraordinary claim can be set aside as misunderstanding, but a group of people, in different places and with no contact, describing versions of the same 20-year cycle created space for comparison. When these testimonies were placed side by side, reviewers noticed consistent narrative features, recurring gaps in memory timelines, moments where subjects described abrupt shifts in identity, and emotional stress arising at almost the exact points where their stories referenced missing decades. These similarities were striking enough that researchers began conducting formal interviews and collecting anonymized data to see how widespread such patterns might be. The interviews revealed that when subjects described ordinary life events, school, work, family, their recall resembled anyone else's. But when discussion turned to the missing years, behaviors shifted. Some individuals paused abruptly or seemed to hit an unseen boundary, as if part of their memory became inaccessible the moment they approached it. Others spoke with clarity for a time, only to stop mid-narrative in visible frustration. These interruptions did not appear random. They seemed to recur in specific places, while talking about reappearing on Earth, while recalling debriefings, or while confronting the realization that entire decades had been taken from them. To clinicians accustomed to the unpredictable variety of trauma expression, the repetition stood out. Alongside these interview findings came reports of how such memories, or the lack of them, shaped everyday life. People who identified themselves as 20 and back, participants often described unexplained disruptions in career or education paths. Some detailed sudden changes in interest or motivation, as though decisions had shifted overnight. Others spoke of struggling with long-term relationships or carrying a sense of nostalgia for connections they could not consciously place. Psychological assessments in a few cases noted fragmented personal timelines, the inner feeling of being far older than one's outward age. None of these outcomes proved the existence of space missions or regression technology, but the overlap in descriptions created a picture of recurring fallout that was difficult to ignore. A common thread in many testimonies was difficulty with stability in adulthood. Some claimed that returning from service left them restless, unable to hold one role for long. Others found that their sense of identity felt divided between an inner self carrying decades of experience and an outer self expected to resume the routine of ordinary life. When such details surfaced across unrelated accounts, investigators asked why. If these were only private fantasies, why did the aftermath look so similar? Dreams and hallucinations usually generate highly personal imagery, not shared consequences. That uniformity drew attention, not because it established fact, but because it suggested something structured was at work. In academic terms, a cautious framework developed. Instead of labeling the accounts as verified memories, some researchers began treating them as experiential clusters. These clusters are defined less by the literal story content, claims of colonies or advanced technology, and more by the structures that appear across separate reports. In this light, 20 and Back is not viewed as a proven phenomenon, but as a recurring profile of cognitive and emotional expression that deserves careful documentation. Early neurological tests and structured interviews are ongoing, but support remains preliminary. Still, acknowledgement of the pattern itself marked a change from earlier years when such testimonies were dismissed outright. Rice's story became one example among many. By comparing his recollections with those of others, investigators observed the same stress reactions, the same narrative halts, and the same difficulties integrating back into daily life. None of this confirms that he served off-world or that time regression occurred, but it places his testimony within a broader constellation of accounts that exhibit repeating traits. For those collecting data, the emphasis shifted from proving events to understanding why dozens of separate individuals present the same storytelling rhythms and the same aftereffects. Skeptics remain firm in their stance. Without physical evidence or official acknowledgement, the safest explanation is still psychological construction. Yet even skeptics concede that the consistency deserves more inquiry, if only to better understand how such intense and coherent belief arises. For supporters, the overlap raises the possibility that these experiences indicate a hidden program with global reach. Between those positions lies the only point of agreement. Whatever the origin, these testimonies carry unusual continuity that cannot be dismissed as random coincidence. That continuity is what keeps the 20 and Back narrative in active discussion. It may ultimately be understood as a cultural myth encoded in memory, or it may point toward realities not yet documented. At present, what can be said with confidence is limited. Multiple accounts have displayed converging features, and those features are strong enough to warrant structured research rather than ridicule. That step, modest as it is, has transformed Rice's story from an isolated outlier into part of a developing case study in how human memory and identity can be shaped by experiences at the edges of credibility. And if memory alone cannot fully explain what people report, the debate inevitably shifts to the second half of their claims, the technology said to make such service possible. The accounts do not stop at missing years. They describe transportation methods, manipulation of time, and devices unfamiliar to mainstream science. If the patterns in memory only take us so far, then the next question becomes whether the technological details at the center of these testimonies can withstand the same level of scrutiny. Portal technology, more than science fiction? When Rice described stepping into a field of shifting pressure and vibration, some dismissed it instantly as the kind of imagery borrowed from speculative fiction. Yet his framing of portal entry as resonance-based travel never disappeared from the conversation. He even compared the sensation to Earth's natural Schumann resonance, suggesting that such underlying frequencies provided a stabilizing layer that made safe passage possible. To critics, this read more like metaphor than mechanics. But in the context of 2025, with expanded investigations into how resonance fields interact with matter and the increasing seriousness of fringe concepts in physics journals, his description no longer rests entirely outside scientific language. For clarity, the Schumann resonance itself is well understood. It is not mystical or hidden. It is simply a set of low-frequency electromagnetic waves generated between Earth's surface and its ionosphere. Rice's link to those vibrations was never about their literal origin in the atmosphere, but about their role as an analogy. How stable frequencies could keep a system coherent during transition. In physics terms, this translates into the pursuit of coherence, whether aligning fields at exact frequencies can reduce distortion when matter crosses difficult thresholds. In quantum physics, coherence underpins tunneling studies. Particles are sometimes found on the far side of barriers they should not classically pass, not through brute force, but through probabilities enhanced by resonance. In laboratories, engineers work on directing such tunneling, giving it structure and repeatability. The experiments involve electrons and photons rather than people, but they show that alignment of frequency can allow passage that classical reasoning long judged impossible. This brings the discussion back to wormholes. The concept, though widely discussed, is largely confined to mathematics. Since the early 20th century, wormholes have existed as theoretical structures within Einstein's field equations. Mainstream physics acknowledges their presence in math, but stresses that for any stable, traversable wormhole to exist, materials with negative energy density, so-called exotic matter, would be essential. Without it, such structures would collapse instantly, long before anything macroscopic could pass through. Publicly, leading theoretical physicists continue to insist that this energy requirement places wormholes well outside engineering reality. Still, adjacent studies in controlled tunneling, entanglement, and resonance manipulation continue to narrow the line between fiction and science. What complicates the field further are ambiguous references in defense-related science. In recent years, partially declassified projects and research summaries have used language hinting at field manipulation and nonlinear propagation relating to energy transport. None confirm the existence of portals, and no U.S. government body has admitted to engineering such systems. However, the phrasing itself invites speculation. Technical reviewers point out that these are not terms typical of standard propulsion work, but closer to descriptions of experimental attempts to move energy or matter through unusual field dynamics. It is easy to see how whistleblowers note the overlap with their testimonies. Still, it remains important to underscore, nothing in the public record shows credible proof that human-scale traversable portals exist. Laboratory progress, though modest, does highlight phenomena that encourage speculation. Research groups have demonstrated teleportation of quantum information, a result that decades ago would have been dismissed as impossible. Photons and ions have been entangled across distances in experiments where their measured states appear linked instantaneously. Similarly, tunneling consistency has been enhanced by constructing engineered fields around experimental barriers, generating measurable increases in transmission. In the early 2020s, popular coverage of these results sometimes blurred the distinction between transporting data and transporting objects. For witnesses like Rice, the language emerging from labs seems to echo their own, even if scale and substance differ substantially. Energy demand remains the strongest counterargument. According to classical models, stabilizing a human-scale portal or wormhole would require bandwidths of power, so vast they surpass anything Earth generates. Exotic matter remains purely speculative, with no empirical sample ever confirmed. But new framing within theoretical physics emphasizes that instead of brute energy, extreme coherence might drastically reduce thresholds. If spacetime itself can be induced to cooperate through resonance alignment, then the energy requirements could be lowered. Rice's anecdotes about stepping into vibration rather than bursting through energy-heavy gateways happen to describe a similar theme. That frequency harmony allows motion. Whether coincidence or inside knowledge, the parallel with ongoing work is evident. Still, it is crucial to incorporate reality as much as imagination. In March 2023, mainstream outlets summarized federal reviews of anomalous phenomena, and one conclusion was explicit. ARO's historical reporting stated it had not found empirical evidence of off-world technology. This fact sits alongside all speculation. No portals have been observed under reproducible lab conditions, no traversable wormholes demonstrated, and no technology revealed officially by defense or civilian scientific agencies. Disclosures about defense research remain vague and cannot be used to confirm Rice's details. The scientific record holds theory and promising lab-scale anomalies, but no public confirmation of human-scale transit. This balance defines 2025's debate. On one side, physics departments at universities repeat the assessment. Wormholes are hypothetical, and portals belong in thought experiment. On the other, experimentalists uncover behaviors in matter, entanglement, tunneling, and coherence that subtly blur former boundaries. The divide is not as sharp as it was a decade ago. Concepts once scoffed at are now framed in mainstream journals as worth exploring, even when hurdles remain colossal. That slow shift creates an intellectual space that invites whistleblower testimony to be heard differently. From there arises the question of defense interest. The military is historically cautious, but also invests in speculative technologies that might someday alter logistics, energy transfer, or communications. Terms like rapid modal displacement or energy relocation, appearing in sanitized budget documents, suggest interest in conditions that at least rhyme with Rice's claims. Without disclosure, it is impossible to connect these terms directly to off-world transport. Yet even partial admissions that defense groups explore unconventional transport models help sustain attention to Rice's words. If there is a thread of practical use in this body of speculation, it lies in scale. Human passage through a portal remains unverified, but the smallest observable quanta of energy and matter have already exhibited behaviors that defy older assumptions. It is in those narrow cracks where testimony from alleged 20 and back participants finds a kind of reflection. The claims are not substantiated by official disclosure, but their imagery resonates with subsets of physics that are very much alive at the paper and laboratory level. Framed this way, Rice's account occupies a space neither wholly isolated from physics nor supported by it. The current state of knowledge tells us that no working gateways exist for human travel. Yet the fields of study he gestured toward, resonance, coherence, tunneling, are precisely those being explored seriously, albeit on microscopic scales. This overlap continues to fuel the discussion, keeping extraordinary testimony tethered, however loosely, to real experimental pathways. The scientific debate may never resolve in neat terms, but each year, and each experiment, nudges the imaginable closer to the plausible. And it raises a question that shifts attention beyond theory. If such systems did exist, what would life on the other side of them involve? That is where Rice's testimony took its boldest turn, not only describing the doorway, but also the deployments he claimed awaited beyond it. Inside off-world service, accounts of off-world duty often turn on one practical question. If such service happened, what would daily life and operations look like? Jason Rice's portrayal was matter of fact. He described bases built beneath the Martian surface, carved into rock as a safeguard against radiation and freezing temperatures. These were not shining arenas of futuristic design, but stark environments focused on survival, airflow, water recycling, and energy balance taking precedence over comfort. According to his testimony, life underground meant constant vigilance. Even a minor system failure could spell catastrophe. Critics have argued that such detail alone is not convincing. No orbiter imagery or rover expedition has ever confirmed buried facilities or large-scale construction on Mars. ARO assessments and NASA's public statements likewise report no evidence of underground complexes. That absence of proof remains central to scientific skepticism. Yet, Rice's version persisted because he continually emphasized the realities of duty cycles and maintenance schedules, describing them in ways that felt more like a soldier's report than a storyteller's embellishment. By 2024, his account no longer stood entirely on its own. Other individuals, from unrelated backgrounds, began speaking publicly about similar installations. They echoed descriptions of underground layouts not designed for spectacle, but for practicality. Long corridors with reinforced pressure locks, clustered living compartments built in modular frames, and entire systems dedicated to controlling carbon dioxide levels. Several testimonies mentioned periodic exposure to natural light through shielded domes, introduced not as luxury, but as a necessity to maintain circadian rhythm and mental health. Each of these details overlapped with fragments of Rice's older accounts. Rice had argued that hiding facilities beneath the surface explained why conventional scans would reveal little evidence of them. Newer voices did not claim special knowledge of Martian imaging data, but they also pointed to underground construction as obvious protection in a hostile environment. What lent these accounts some weight was the fact that mainstream engineering discussions had long suggested the same. Studies within NASA and other agencies proposed that subsurface habitats would be the most effective protection against cosmic radiation. These papers said nothing of secret fleets or military service, but the engineering logic paralleled what whistleblowers described. Their accounts, whatever their origin, lined up closely with real-world design necessities.